Have you noticed how normal life still looks the same, but somehow doesn't feel the same anymore? Nothing collapsed. Nothing officially broke. There was no single moment when everything changed. No announcement. No warning. No clear dividing line between before and after. And yet, something is different. Not visibly, but structurally. Not in what people are doing, but in how it feels to do it. You still go to the same stores. You still pay the same types of bills. You still follow the same routines. From the outside, nothing seems unfamiliar. But internally, something has shifted. A subtle awareness. A quiet calculation. A constant background evaluation of cost, timing, and consequence. Not because you want to, but because you have to. And the most unsettling part is how gradual this shift has been. So gradual that most people never saw it happening in real time. They only noticed it in hindsight. In small moments. Moments that seemed insignificant on their own, but meaningful when remembered together. Like standing in a grocery store and instinctively putting something back. Not because you couldn't afford it, but because it no longer felt justified. Not necessary. Not worth it. Or opening your banking app and realizing that your balance looked smaller than expected, even though you hadn't done anything unusual. No emergency. No major purchase. Just the accumulation of ordinary life. Ordinary expenses. Ordinary costs. Operating under new conditions. Conditions that quietly became more demanding, more restrictive, more precise. It is not the difficulty that makes this moment special. There has always been difficulty. Economic cycles have always fluctuated. Prices have always changed. Humans have always adjusted. However, adaptation has evolved. Historically, adaptability frequently meant short-term change. Waiting for things to get better. Awaiting a settlement in prices. For the return of stability. Adaptation now more often refers to long-term change. Not holding out for a turnaround. Accepting a new baseline, however. An unretrenchable baseline. A starting point that turns into the new standard. Not because it was a choice. However, since it remained. This results in a subtle but significant psychological change. Because income is not the only factor that defines stability. Predictability is what defines it. By the capacity for foresight. To make an estimate. To make plans without continual uncertainty. The mind can unwind when things are predictable. It enables people to look beyond the here and now. To envision what might be in the future. To assume risks. To make a change investment. However, attention becomes more focused when predictability declines. The emphasis turns to preservation. In the direction of safety. In an effort to prevent disturbance. Life is less about growth. And further information regarding upkeep. Preservation of equilibrium. Stability preservation. Preservation of continuity. Margin is one of the most crucial yet unseen components of financial stability. Wealth is not margin. Margin does not equate to abundance. Simply said, margin is room. The gap between what enters and exits. The gap between duty and expectation. Between routine and disruption, there is space. Uncertainty is absorbed by margin. Surprise is absorbed by margin. Error is absorbed by margin. Everything becomes more sensitive when there is no margin. Less robust. More exacting. Small errors in judgment might have more serious repercussions. Larger modifications are necessary for minor disruptions. And forgiveness in life diminishes. It's not impossible, but less tolerant. Less adaptable. Less accessible. This is the real way that financial pressure works. Not by way of an unexpected disaster, but by gradually removing the margin. Through the gradual constriction of space. Through the subtle conversion of coziness into computation. Take cautious when calculating. And make caution a habit. Habit that endures even in situations that seem steady at first glance. Because people are difficult to forget once they have mastered operating without margin. They are still conscious. Be mindful. Paying attention. Not because I'm afraid. However, it was necessary. Meanwhile, income itself has assumed a new psychological function. In the past, income was a sign of advancement, progress, possibility. Income now symbolizes continuity for a lot of people. The capacity to maintain the current structure. Not necessarily to make it bigger. Not necessary to make things better, but to keep it up. In order to avoid regression. In order to maintain stability. Additionally, this modification affects how people perceive their own work. Progress is no longer assured by effort. Maintenance is guaranteed by effort, which can eventually feel very different. Because advancement and human drive are closely related. To get better. To motion. Perception shifts when effort results in stability rather than progress. Expectations change. Behavior changes. Not in a big way, but slowly, silently. In this setting, debt becomes increasingly important. Not as a failure, not as carelessness, as infrastructure, however, a part of continuity structure. Debt makes it possible to change the timing, enables the smoothing of disruption, permits the temporary preservation of stability. However, debt also adds rigidity. Income in the future becomes partially fixed. Future adaptability is somewhat limited. Additionally, voluntary choices eventually turn into required commitments. Not due to a crisis, however, due to structure. Structure that gradually builds up. Structure that is accepted as normal. Structure that transforms daily existence. This effect is amplified by housing, since dwelling is a symbol of permanence, place, identity, continuity. People arrange their lives according to where they reside, their habits, their labor, their connections, their feeling of inclusion. Adjustment becomes challenging when housing costs rise in relation to income. It's not impossible. However, it is disruptive. Thus, people adjust in different ways. Discretionary spending is compressed by them. They postpone progress. They put off change. Not because they're not ambitious. However, stability necessitates setting priorities. Setting priorities that reduce the number of alternatives. Savings used to be a sign of choice. The capacity to seize opportunities. To absorb disturbance. To make a decision. Savings stood for freedom from short-term restrictions. Time itself becomes more inflexible in the absence of savings. Decisions have to be in line with the current situation. Opportunities and available resources must coincide. There is less flexibility, not readily apparent, but in terms of structure. Additionally, this structural change modifies behavior in subtle but significant ways. People start to be more wary, more intentional, more conscious of the consequences. Not necessarily gloomy, but practical, rooted, exact. This accuracy gets ingrained in everyday existence. A component of regular thought. A component of unconscious consciousness. Individuals assess purchases in different ways. Consider obligations in a new way. Consider risk in a different way. Not in a big way, but continuously. And culture is reshaped by constancy. Modifies expectations. Transforms the emotional experience of daily life. Because solidity is more than just material. It's sentimental, psychological, experiential. It is the sense of security that comes with habit. The belief that continuity will endure. The sense that there will be tolerable similarities between now and tomorrow. Perception shifts as that emotion even slightly wanes. Not in a panic, but into consciousness. Understanding that stability needs care. Has to be managed. Demands involvement. Not a passive anticipation, but ongoing upkeep. And this is the moment's defining change. Don't fall apart, but upkeep. Not vanishing. However, compression. Not a crisis, but limitation. Constraint that lurks beneath the surface of everyday existence. Constraint that modifies behavior covertly. Limitation that only becomes apparent with time and experience. Everything goes on from the outside. People are employed. People go shopping. People go on trips. Humans are living beings. Life goes on as usual. However, that life's internal experience has evolved. It needs extra care, additional computation, greater consciousness. Not all the time, but continuously. Furthermore, reality is more defined by consistency than by discrete occurrences. Because individual moments do not shape reality. Patterns shape it. Patterns that recur over time. Patterns that develop into expectations. Anticipation that turns into conviction. Belief that turns into action. Behavior that develops into a structure. Structure that returns to normal. Additionally, something no longer feels transitory once it becomes typical. It seems to last forever. Incorporated. Accepted. Not questioned. Not opposed. Just lived. This is the real way that economic transformation happens. Not with a dramatic break, but by a slow process of normalization. Constraint normalization. Normalization of adaptability. Normalization of the smaller margin. Until the new structure gradually disappears. Not because it's unreal. However, it's familiar. Furthermore, familiarity has great power. Perception is shaped by it. It molds expectations. Identity is shaped by it. Humans are not just externally adaptable, but on the inside. They modify their perception of possibilities, modify their future-oriented presumptions, modify the way they define stability. You can usually pinpoint the exact minute this change became apparent to you if you take the time to think about it. Not very dramatic, not disastrous. Just be clear. A realization that things had changed, not for a short time, but in terms of structure. A moment when consciousness took the place of presumption, and you started acting in a different way after that. Thinking in a different way, seeing in a new way, not worse, not any better, but in a different way, more conscious, more accurate, more aware of the unseen factors influencing daily existence. And comprehension starts with that awareness. Because structural change cannot be undone once it is observed. You start to see trends, links, causes and effects in relationships, between revenue and expenses, between work and results, between structure and stability. And that knowledge alters your way of seeing the world, not out of fear, but clearly. Clarity that permits modification. Clarity that makes planning possible. Clarity that makes control possible. Because resisting change does not give you control. Understanding it gives you control. I can see it clearly. Identifying its trends, identifying its direction, and making the necessary adjustments. You are not alone if you have experienced this change, even in minor ways. The same adjustment is being made by millions of others. Silently, separately, gradually, not as a communal occasion. However, as a collective experience. An event that, rather than headlines, defines this age. But in the course of daily existence. And the most important question is not whether change is happening. It already is. The question is whether you can see it clearly. Because those who see clearly can adapt deliberately. And those who adapt deliberately retain something incredibly valuable. Not certainty, not perfection, but agency. The ability to respond intentionally to an evolving reality. If this perspective resonates with you, it means you've already begun noticing what many overlook. And I'm curious, when did you first feel it? What was the moment when ordinary life started to feel different? There is much more beneath the surface than most people realize. And in the videos ahead, we'll continue exploring it. Slowly, one layer at a time. If you stayed until the end, it means you're paying attention. And that alone changes everything. If this perspective resonated with you in any way, if even one part of this felt familiar, let me know. Not because there's a right or wrong answer, but because every perspective reveals something deeper about what's really happening beneath the surface. You can share your experience in the comments. I read every single one, and your perspective might help someone else realize they're not alone in what they've been feeling. If you found this video valuable, you can support it with a simple like. You can subscribe. You can support me by leaving a short comment. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to be the first to know about my other videos. I'll see you in the next one.